I'm going to talk about designing a digital learning environment for a postgraduate subject I'm working on at the moment. So I'm basing it on Valestiano's 2011 research, and basically his big idea is that you can design opportunities for digital activities and learning that really make a difference and open up new thinking and even be transformative, but that you can't construct those experiences. You can only design them. So the learner has to engage as well as be engaged to have a really good experience, which kind of makes sense. Valestianos argues that we as educators should be designing those opportunities, even if we can't make students learn, because there's not a lot of transformation out there in digital learning environments at the moment, although there are more courses than ever online. And if you take a good look around at many learning management systems, that's if you have access, of course, you'd have to agree with Valestianos. Technology can be a tool for duplication rather than transformation, and often is. Other research has found that teachers may use learning technologies and environments in the same way they use their old ones. That's like an information dump or a virtual filing cabinet. So teachers' experience and beliefs guide how they use technology, as does the context in which they work. So we can't automatically assume that because technology is getting better, that teaching and learning is keeping up and keeping a pace. And students also have uneven skills. Despite all the hype about digital natives, you need to make explicit design decisions to build those skills in using Web 2 tools, particularly for challenging tasks and higher order thinking tasks. So in practice that means not leaving it to chance, that they'll just pick it up. So keeping in mind that teachers and students are shaped by their experiences, new tools can make the teaching and learning job easier. And certainly I've seen that where I am at UTS, where Canvas LMS has been introduced as part of a strategy to boost postgraduate learning. So the introduction of the new LMS has been an opportunity to really rethink teaching practice and encourage more learner-centred approaches at a really basic level, because you need to think about how to do things differently in a different system, and because the technology is built on more modern principles and it's easier to use. So I'm interested in Valestiano's learning and design principles that aim to provide learners with opportunities to engage with potentially transformative learning experiences. I want to put into practice building engagement beyond the course for authentic learning and creating a lasting impression, and activities that are challenging, intriguing, fun, and include reflective practice. But I guess the question is how? Big question. Authentic learning, I think, is important in this because it's a way of going beyond typical course activities. The design of activities of work real assessment situates learning in experience. These tasks are often fuzzy and they need to be defined. So learning designed in this way can also include collaboration with both in and out of the course rather than an individual task, and it helps students develop the kind of graduate attributes and social and soft skills that employers increasingly expect. And it's also a good way to introduce learners to professional communities of practice, and for students to know that professional practice and knowledge changes all the time, and the teacher is not the font of all wisdom. Lifelong learning is part of everyone's journey now, and I think social networks, as Buckingham Shum has indicated, are a really important part of that. Otherwise, Valestianos has also discussed how difficult it can be to design, support and sustain a community of practice, and how the organisational structure of a network must be considered in that digital learning context. And it's also being aware that technologies themselves are not neutral and reflect a certain paradigm or mindset. They're usually hierarchical and teacher-centric, and about group structures and permissions. So in terms of learning design, that often means, in my case, trying to extend the LMS and the digital learning environment. So using more open tools and networks, like whether it be a Google collaboration sheet, that allow students to engage beyond the walled garden of the LMS and do things a bit differently. I'll talk more about that later. But I guess the intrigue side of things, how can we do that? I mean, it's offering learners the chance to participate in interesting but unfamiliar and difficult tasks. So many online games use this idea to challenge and stimulate their players and get them hooked even. So quests also can stimulate that same intrigue. And in terms of taking risks, we're all more inclined to take risks when we have some skin in the game. So if learners are given real-world problems to engage with and solve, then and be responsible for talking about their findings or reporting them to interested people, it does raise the stakes and hopefully the learning too. So how to provide those opportunities to engage outside university and outside of the typical environment? Well, I think we've found in the case of Web 2 practices, particularly social media such as Facebook, they haven't always been integrated well into the classroom setting because the Web 2 tools are used in different contexts and obviously very different ways to educational tasks. If you think about assessments, for example, the culture of being assessed means that online experience is very different and students are less likely to collaborate and publish their work openly in an open environment, whereas social media is much more conversational and unstructured. So back to Veliciano's principles, designed to make a lasting impression. Easier said than done, but I've already talked about the importance of real-world collaboration and how these principles kind of overlap. So his point is that it needs to be memorable, or why bother, which is something that we don't always keep in mind when we're designing, I think. Likewise, learning obviously has to be clear and structured and well planned, but it can also be fun, creative and exciting, and it should be, and that will also help make it more memorable. I think cognitive load theory can also support designing to make an impression and to engage learners, because if you reduce the extraneous load for a good user experience, learners don't get overwhelmed by the information. And at the same time, if you adjust intrinsic cognitive load, you can make it more challenging for expert users. So if the learning activity is adjusted to different skill levels and allow a degree of learner control, learners are much more likely to be motivated and engaged and have that lasting impression. Where I work at the moment, again, the behaviourist and cognitive information processing tasks are designed to be completed online at home, to reserve the classroom for flipped learning and constructivist tasks. And I think there's plenty of research that backs up the design of assessments and learning activities that reflect professional practice using typical tools of the trade that learners will use once they graduate, going back to that work real type idea. So for example, in the course I'm designing, students in journalism could be expected to engage in social media activities. Blogging and publishing on the web are all very typical of the modern journos profession. And so we reach out for that kind of behaviour in the classroom and online as well, and in the digital space. Reflection is also important in metacognition and learning to learn skills. So that means designing in reflective prompts and practices as we have for this subject in EDGI 903. So the same kinds of principles, having provoking questions that can guide reflection, that can be private, shared with the group or publicly, depending on the context and purpose of the learning activity. That's really important, and aligning those reflections to the assessment is even better, so that students are learning in a very structured way but also linking it back to the outcomes. So, not much to design for really, being a tad sarcastic. Of course, to engage beyond the course and make a lasting impression, to stimulate all of those things like risk-taking and engagement and reflection. It's not a simple, straightforward task. It does require a lot of thought, preparation and skill, which I think is why learning design has become so highly valued. But I think Velestianos does have a good framework for that, learning design. So thank you very much for your time.